Dear students, after studying this module, you shall be able to understand the nature and meaning of reading, identify various neurological mechanisms of reading, learn about various types of dyslexia and their neurological basis. Reading is a complex cognitive process. It is known as visually guided thinking. It is the mental process that requires perceptual and other cognitive processes. Good knowledge of language and grammar is also required. Some understand reading as a process in which we identify and extract meaning from individual words, while others describe it as a process of organizing thematic structure of entire text presented at a time. It is a skill that has great value in contemporary society. It is of utmost importance to discover the neural basis of reading and the problems of poor readers. Traditionally, reading and its disorders were reflected as a mental process that involved hierarchical organization of orthographies. The level of analysis included the phoneme, morpheme, syntax and semantics of the sentence. Go has formulated the simple view of reading, in which reading comprehension equal the product of single word recognition and listening competition, or reading comprehension is equal to word recognition into listening comprehension. Later models were developed on this definition and word recognition, that a simple cognitive activity was studied to understand the process of reading. With the development of cognitive neuropsychology, researchers had arrived at new classification of reading and its disorders. They proposed that the reading behavior is mediated by activity in which particular areas of brain are involved. Since reading in itself is a complex activity, each of its components can be broken down into constituent cognitive processes which may be organized in different parts of the brain. Further, they found that many of these constituent cognitive processes involved in language also play a role in other behaviors. For example, some of the areas of the brain that participate in short-term memory and visual pattern recognition are closely linked to reading process as well. This module is an attempt to highlight reading as a complex mental process in which various other mental processes like word recognition, listening comprehension are involved, and there is localization of each mental process in different parts of the brain. It also highlights the reading disorders and presents the in-depth analysis of reading disorder. The disorder largely depends on the level at which the cognitive process is impaired. In effect, the type of reading disorder will depend on which part of the brain shows abnormality. Researchers using the cognitive neuroscience approach also have their disposal an increasing array of techniques for studying the process of reading and its disorders. Research methods. To understand the process of reading, cognitive psychologists have used various research methods. Recently, cognitive neuroscientists have used several techniques to study the localization of brain areas in each cognitive process. Some such techniques are described below. Recording eye movements. Recording eye movements is an unobtrusive method of providing a detailed online record of attention-related processes involving in reading. According to EZ Reader model, the next eye movement is programmed when only part of the processing of the currently fixated word has occurred. Completion of frequency checking word is the signal to initiate an eye movement program, and completion of lexical access is the signal for a shift of covert attention to the next word. However, it is hard to be sure precisely what processes occur during such fixation. Reading aloud. This method assesses the reaction of reader and types of errors made in reading. This is a very simple and crude method of assessment and carries at least 3 limitations. It is an unnatural method. The speed at which we read aloud is half of silent reading, and The errors in reading aloud may not reflect genuine reading errors because of memorial interference and eye-voice span. Word identification technique. The term word identification referred to accessing either the name of the word or its meaning. Therefore, this technique involves greater diversity of techniques than those considered so far. Rayner and Polacek developed tasks in word identification technique that involve lexicon decision task and naming task. In lexicon decision task, the subject was assessed on time taken to decide whether the strings of letters forms a word or not. In naming task, the person has to recall a word aloud as fast as possible. The most closely related model was interactive activation model that took into account the interaction of both data-driven and conceptual-driven information while reading a word in the text. Based on interactive activation model, cohort theory and trace theory agreed on various assumptions around word recognition. The assumptions on which common agreement occurred are as follows. Activation of several candidate words occurs early in the process of word recognition. The speed of word identification indicates the process in parallel fashion, and the activation level of candidate word is graded rather than being high or low. Finally, both data-driven and conceptually driven process combine to produce word recognition. The variation is observed only on how this happens. However, little agreement was found on the size and the number of basic perceptual units in the spoken word recognition. Different theorists attach different levels of importance on features like phonemes and syllables, etc. Thus, cognitive psychologists have attempted to use techniques that were not so accurate. Though this method ensures no disruption by the reader, the process is only inferred from the behavior of the other. To bring more accurate form of technique, neuroscientists have used new techniques. Functional MRI. The most sophisticated technique used by neuroscientists is functional brain imaging for studying the localization or language in healthy subjects. Researchers have contributed valuable information by using fMRI in reading process. They capture the brain activity during silent reading in healthy people. This technique presented an accurate measure of activity in natural condition of silent reading. The activity in brain was assessed through the periods involving control period of no reading and silent reading following interchangeably. Findings suggested that the brain activity was patchy and variations were observed in activity from subject to subject and trial to trial. However, these activities were widespread over lateral surface of the brain. PET scan. The studies using PET scan looks at the temporal lobe activity involved in naming objects within particular categories. The subjects are presented three different categories of images: famous faces, animals, and tools. The studies show that the temporal lobe is actively involved during performance of these three tasks. Finally, an amalgamation of various types of techniques, that is cognitive and neurocognitive approaches, healthy and brain damaged patients, give a more precise view of the process of reading. Reading as a cognitive process. Most investigators believe that reading involves at least two different processes: abstract letter identification that involves comprehension and recognition of the whole word or sight reading, and phonetic reading that involves grapheme-phoneme conversion or sound reading. This facilitates the pronunciation of each grapheme presented in printed. Cognitive neuropsychologists have identified some of the processes and structure that may be involved in reading. Ellis and Young proposed dual rote model of reading. They identified the components of reading by studying the patient who exhibited acquired dyslexia, that is, impairment of reading produced by brain damaged adults who were previously skilled readers. According to the dual route model, there is an indirect route between the printed words and the speech based on grapheme-phoneme conversion. This indicates that each word is converted into distinctive sound and then presented in buffer of sounds. This process takes longer time than the second route, which is more direct based on the lexical axis. The understanding of this reading process highlights the fact that reading is a complex process which involves various other cognitive processes. To understand which kind of disorder an individual is suffering from, it is imperative to understand at what level the disorder is occurring and which part of the brain is shown abnormality. Reading disorders. Within the domain of reading, there is possibility of two major kinds of reading disability, that is developmental dyslexia and acquired dyslexia. Developmental dyslexia involves deficits in reading during developmental phases from childhood onwards. Three kinds of developmental dyslexia: dysphonetic, dysdetic, and the third category showing amalgamation, the above mentioned two forms of developmental dyslexia have been identified. Individuals with dysphonetic dyslexia have difficulties with decoding sounds associated with words, that is auditory linguistic defects. In dysdetic dyslexia, individuals exhibit difficulties with identifying whole word, that is visual spatial defects. The third category incorporates both auditory linguistic and visual spatial subtypes of dyslexia. Acquired dyslexia is the reading disability that occurs in the individual due to brain damage and is generally followed by an accident or some other trauma faced by the individual. Epidemiology. Studies indicate that prevalence of dyslexia is much higher in boys as compared to girls. However, the variation in the account of prevalence rate was observed in many studies. In some investigations, boys suffering with reading disorder were found to be 1.3 to 1.7 times more than girls. In the clinical groups like externalizing versus internalizing disorders, the male predominance was twice as great as that for girls. Types of acquired dyslexia. There are two ways of conceptualizing acquired dyslexia. They are the model building approach and classical neurological approach. Model building approach constructs its meanings much like algorithms, and the taxonomy of the reading disability is elaborated on the basis of the type of impairment. The classical neurological approach is derived on the basis of the brain damaged patients. Coulthard used model building approach to understand the various types of dyslexia. It is depicted as follows. Attentional dyslexia. This kind of dyslexia is identified when an individual faces difficulty in attending to a word due to the presence of other letter or irrelevant markers like underline, bold letter, etc. The presence of irrelevant markers makes naming of the previous letter difficult. Positional dyslexia. Person with positional dyslexia may misread or may read just half of a word. The terms whether may be read as smoother and stronger may be read as stroke. This kind of error, in which either the word in suffix or prefix positions are misread, is known as positional dyslexia. Spelling dyslexia. Person with spelling dyslexia can read a word only after spelling out the individual letters. This indicates that reading word in Gestalt is quite challenging for these readers. Phonological dyslexia. Persons with phonological dyslexia can read familiar words but have difficulty reading unfamiliar or producible non-words. The damage is observed in left frontal lobe in the Broca's area and the left insular region of the brain. Surface dyslexia. A person with surface dyslexia or whole word dyslexia can read words phonetically but has difficulty reading irregularly spelled words. Studies suggest that lesion of the left temporal lobe can cause surface dyslexia. Direct dyslexia. Direct dyslexia resembles transcortical sensory aphasia, except that the words in the question are written and not spoken. The individual suffering with deep dyslexia is able to read aloud even though he cannot understand the word he is saying. Neurological basis of reading disorder. In the last 2 decades, neurological bases of reading disorders have been understood better due to advances in both behavioral and molecular genetics, chromosome-based studies, studies on sibling pair analysis where one sibling has an extreme score have been used to understand genetic loci. The studies have provided significant evidence of qualitative trait located in 2 cm region of the interval between D65105 and TNFB markers situated in 6p21.3. Other replicated regions for RG include linkages like p36, 2p, 15 to 16 and 15q21c reviewed in Smith et al. In addition, a recently completed whole genome search of 2 separate samples identified the location of another likely QTL influencing RD on chromosome 18p. Hence, at this point, it appears that there are at least 5 QTLs that influence RD. Several hypotheses about the transmission of dyslexia have been advanced. Dyslexia are not X-linked disorders, and there is little incidence of parental gender effects on transmission. Slight preponderance of males over females has however been observed. There are major locus effects in several samples. Dyslexia is genetically heterogeneous. A necessary disease LE hypothesis can be rejected because there is evidence for major locus effect on transmission of normal violation in reading skills. Brain mechanisms. Studies indicate that though the overall volume of neocortex did not differ by group, dyslexia and non-dyslexia, the insular and anterior superior neocortex was significantly smaller in normal than in the reading disorder group, whereas retrocallosal cortex was larger. Brain activity in multiple regions showed that there was no special localization of one brain area in reading task. The PET and the fMRI studies showed difference in brain activity when individuals with dyslexia were compared with the control group. Reduced activity in the Wernicke's area accompanied by an increased activity in more posterior locations which highlighted the temporal parietal function. Other studies indicated the following: increased metabolism in the lingular gyrus and greater symmetry of activation in lingular and prefrontal regions, greater activation in the medial temporal lobe bilaterally, reduction in left posterior temporal cortex near Wernicke's area and the left temporal parietal cortex near the angular gyrus during rhyme detection task. During syntactic task, normal activation in both anterior, temporal and inferior frontal area. In non-verbal tonal memory task, an uninterrupted right hemisphere reduction was observed. Studies indicated mixed results in activation of left insular region. They also observed reduced blood flow in posterior perisylvian area of brain. One of the tasks involved visual motion sensitivity task. Dyslexics performed more poorly on this task than the other. Neuroimaging results show activity reduction in part of the ventral visual pathways, especially in the area of MTIVs. These results suggest possible visual processing deficits in both brain and behavior in person with dyslexia. In a recent MRI study, it was found that there was a decrease in gray matter in the left temporal lobe and bilateral decrease on the function of the temporal, parietal and occipital lobes. However, these are general pointers and one cannot reach a definite conclusion based on these observations. Reading disorders in different orthographic systems. Reading disabilities can vary depending on the languages of varying orthographic system. Most languages, including English, contain many irregular words, are not very conducive for individuals with dyslexia. In contrast, languages like Italian, Spanish, Finnish, Czech and Japanese are dyslexic-friendly languages. However, when individuals acquiring any language mentioned above were asked to read while their heads were in PET scanner, their scans all showed the same pattern. A decrease in the activity of lex occipito-temporal region was found. Thus, this finding suggests strong evidence of neurological basis of reading and its disorders. Summary: some of the areas of the brain that participate in short-term memory and visual pattern recognition are closely linked to reading process as well. Neuroscientists have used techniques like functional brain imaging to study the localization of brain areas in each cognitive process and reading disorder. There are two major kinds of reading disability, that is developmental dyslexia and acquired dyslexia. Two ways of conceptualizing acquired dyslexia include model building approach and classical neurological approach. Neuroimaging results show activity reduction in part of the ventral visual pathway, especially in the area of MTIVs. These results suggest possible visual processing deficits in both brain and behavior in the persons with dyslexia.